Hi, guys, and welcome to another 7-minute lecture. We're looking at yet another controversial debate today, something I'm sure you've encountered before as well. Colonialism. What were the good things about it, and what were the bad? Do we even understand colonialism? Issues like that. Now, obviously, on this channel, we tend to avoid concrete positions. This channel is a lot more interested in exploring the various arguments around the topic rather than in telling you what to believe. So, hopefully, we can look at some of the key arguments within 7 minutes. On the side that says colonialism was a good thing, a common argument I often find is that a lot of development in infrastructure is usually brought in by the conquerors. There's a great scene in Monty Python's Life of Brian, one of the funniest and smartest movies ever made, where there's a famous rebel group plotting to overthrow the Roman government. And I'm sure many of you have seen the scene where the leaders like, what have the Romans ever done for us? And one guy goes, the aqueduct. And the leader's like, oh, well, yes, but other than the aqueduct, what have they ever given us? And one by one, people say sanitation, the roads, medicine, irrigation, blah, blah, blah. And the leader finally says, all right, but apart from the sanitation, medicine, education, wine, public order, irrigation, roads, the freshwater system, and public health, what have the Romans ever done for us? And one guy says, brought peace. And the leader's like, oh, shut up, because he's had enough of it. But it's a point that you do see many people bringing up even when discussing modern empires. And I think there is a point to that, since great powers typically do tend to bring a lot of infrastructure to their colonies, which the colonies then benefit from for generations, even after the conquerors leave. And here, of course, the sort of poster boy for empire in modern discussions is the British one, mostly because that's the one which keeps getting pulled up in discussions like this. People say, look, just consider what the British did in their colonies, particularly in India, for instance, where they built railways, roads, bridges, courts of law, modern institutions, they abolished native practices, and so on. And in one sense, they would be right. It is true that modernization, in a certain sense, was brought to many of these places in the form of the British. However, on the flip side of that, one could also say, look, it's ridiculous to argue that the British somehow introduced most of this technology to Asia, as if all these countries would have still been riding around in bullock carts and living in huts if the British hadn't arrived. Many nations that were not conquered by the British are modernized today as well. So there's no reason to suggest that without them, most of these countries would still be stuck in the 17th century. Japan, for instance, was never a British colony, and it's arguably the most technologically advanced country in Asia. And here I do need to make an important point so that we don't bash the British too much. Often when the term colonialism is brought up, it becomes something which people just use to bash modern European and maybe sometimes the ancient Roman empires with. When the reality is that most races and most civilizations around the world practice colonialism whenever they had the military power to do so. There are many, many supposed scholars and experts today who can go on for hours and hours about the atrocities of Western empire, but they seem to be completely oblivious to how the Western world has never had some kind of empire on some kind of monopoly, right, on empire. In fact, if you were to look at some of the most powerful imperial forces in the 19th and 20th centuries, both the Ottoman Empire and the Japanese would be at the very top of that list. So it's not a white versus colored issue at all. Please keep that in mind when these discussions come up. With that said, however, we also need to keep in mind that race and culture have historically played a huge role in all colonial enterprises. This idea of civilizing the savages and using that as a pretext for conquest is rampant throughout history. And one can argue that this trend persists even to the current day with the American empire, where the major interventions that have caught the public imagination, be it Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan, have all been made with moral superiority as one of the key arguments, that the American way of life is not just superior, but so superior that American soldiers must export that to other parts of the world and sort of guard these other parts of the world with this superior way of life against the evil communists or jihadists or whatever. It's easy to dismiss this as jingoism, but you would kind of be justified in a sense if you held on to that view. For instance, I did a video on moral relativism a few days ago. If you're the type of person who believes that a certain set of values is indeed superior, and if you're a good person who wants the best for the world, then it is logically consistent for you to say that the powerful have an obligation to export those superior values to the world. If you believe that certain lifestyles will bring about more happiness than others, and if you care about the world, then surely you would want the world to follow this lifestyle as well. Look at the way countries are made to follow human rights now. Look at the way in which women's rights, LGBT rights, secular values, all of these things are permeating around the world. This wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't for modern Western colonialism in particular. You could, of course, bring back my, oh, but what about Japan argument? Japan was never a colony, right? But let's face it, Japan, for all intents and purposes, was an American colony for several decades after World War II. It might not have been official, but they had no military policy, no economic policy without the Americans for a long, long time. So they were a colony, just not an official one. The same goes with South Korea, Israel, Singapore. All these countries hailed as non-colonial success stories. They're all unofficial colonies. It's just that it's never asserted in public. That's the only difference. The final point I'd like to leave you with is dignity. Let's say that colonialism does indeed spread wealth and development. Even if that was granted, would it still justify the systematic subjugation of people as second-class citizens? Would you justify the taking of slaves from Africa by saying, oh, look, at least they are better off as African Americans today than if they had still been in Africa? Of course you wouldn't, because you know that the transatlantic slavery industry isn't diminished in any sense by the fact that their descendants live a better life now than they would in Somalia or Ethiopia. Similarly, one could argue that the systematic brutality of colonialism was far too much for it to be justified using the, oh, but look at the good things that it brought argument. So as usual, guys, tell me what you think about the topic. Do you stand on any particular side in this debate, or do you believe that a more nuanced position is the right one? If you like content like this, please don't forget to share and subscribe. Thank you, take care, and I'll see you soon.